See some people coming in. Welcome, welcome. We're just getting things started, and we'll just be kind of waiting a minute here as attendees join the chat. And then in just a moment here, we will get things started. Thanks for being here today. I don't know if it's evening or morning, wherever you may be in the world. I'm here in beautiful Wales in the United Kingdom today, and it's about evening time where I'm at. By way of introduction, I'll just go ahead and start by introducing myself. We can kind of get off to a slow start here. But hello, my name is Maz Amelie. I am the head of product design here at Metabase, and it is my pleasure to be your MC or host today for this fireside chat where we're going to be discussing data culture. And I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists today in just a moment. But first, let me just kind of tell you what our agenda is. So today we're going to be talking with TJ Muehleman, who's the founder at Standard Co., and Krishnan Raghupathi, who's a product manager at Clockwise. As I mentioned, we're going to be discussing the best ways to build a data-centric culture within an organization. So we're going to talk about how to make data a front and center part of your daily life, what tools to use to do this. We're going to share some real stories and best practices and talk about what to watch out for when it comes to developing data-driven mindsets in teams as well as organizations. And so if you have any questions for our guests as they're speaking, just go ahead and leave them under the Q&A tab at the bottom of the UI. We'll go ahead and answer those during the Q&A session at the end of our chat. So I'll go ahead and first and just have our panelists introduce themselves a bit. Krishnan, would you like to start for us?
Sure. Thank you, Maz, and welcome everyone. My name is Krishnan Raghupathi. I'm a product manager here at Clockwise. I own some of our newer growth initiatives, and I'm the PM for our data platform, which is making sure every department of the company has the data they need to be very, very effective. Yeah, I'm so excited to be here and chat about this.
Great, thanks, Krishnan. And TJ, why don't you go ahead and say a little bit about yourself?
Good morning, everyone. My name is TJ Muehleman. I'm calling in from Seattle on the West Coast here in the US. I am founder and CEO of Standard Co. We're a data platform. We work mostly with global health organizations like the World Health Organization, CDC, ministries of health throughout Africa and South Asia. And we help them kind of with three areas. One, collect data. So we have a series of tools that allow them to go out into the field to collect data about disease or impact assessments. We have a data engineering kind of platform which lets them clean data and manipulate the data so that we can then feed it into a BI platform to actually do analytics and build dashboards. And I've been building data systems for a little over 20 years now. So I'm really excited to be here.
Great. Thank you both for that introduction. Well, all right, just to kick us off, I think that the first topic we're going to be digging into is just broadly talking about why data culture is important. And maybe we'll hear some anecdotes from you both about just how data culture influenced decisions in your organizations in a good way or maybe in a bad way. So I don't know which of you would like to field that first or kick us off, but broadly, that's sort of our prompt to start things off.
TJ, do you want to take this first? Or?
Yeah, I'll kick it off. So I love this question because I've always been sort of a very data-centric person, and I think a lot of technical people say that my upbringing came as a software engineer. And so data has always been something that I've kind of leaned on to help drive decisions. But what I've been shocked to find is that I'm sort of unique in that position, especially when you kind of get outside of the engineering realm. And you see a lot of people who are more reactive with data, meaning they'll go make decisions based on their gut or based on sort of some anecdote or some, somebody may have told them like, hey, we need this product idea, or we need that something's happening. And so what I've been focused on specifically for the last like 10 years is how do we implement a data culture? How do we implement what we think of as like a data experience? And to make data instead of reactive, more proactive, and start using data to kind of guide decisions. And so I'll use a good example is we work with a bunch of NGOs kind of all over the world. And we work with one in Nicaragua, and they dig water wells. And they used to dig water wells based on sort of what somebody told them to do. And they would say, well, that makes sense. Let's go dig a water well here. And in a lot of cases, it worked out well and it was fine, but their optimization wasn't there. And you see that in a lot of impact organizations where they're not really optimizing for what should we be doing with our limited resources and money. And so we've been helping them kind of implement a more of a data-driven framework where instead of digging water wells based on what someone told them or based on a hunch, to use data where population needs clean water, where sickness is prevalent because of poor water treatment. And so we've kind of helped them tilt that decision making, instead of being reactive and sort of anecdotal, to being more, oh, there's a population here, there's bad water, there's a lot of sickness, and if we dig water wells here, we'll see an impact, and then measuring that over time. So that's kind of, that to me sort of makes me excited and makes me tick, and why a data-driven culture is so important.
Yeah, that's an amazing anecdote. In fact, I have something very similar to that. I wasn't always a data person. I had an aha moment when it came to data culture. Something that happened was my team at Microsoft, where I used to work, had actually launched a feature recently. And one of my PM mentors brought his entire team together into a room for 90 minutes. And he made one of the PMs who was instrumental in launching this new feature just go look at the dashboard and explain for 5 minutes what was important, what users were on, how users were onboarding, just talk through that for 5 minutes. And after that PM had done that, he actually went around the room and said, okay, this is now a quiz. All of you have to ask one question, and you have to ask exactly you have to figure out what to ask to get new insights. And it was kind of like a competition almost. He gamified the process of data. But then in those 90 minutes, the amount of insights that we were able to come up with, and the level of like conscious decision making that we were able to do based on the data just opened my eyes. And ever since, I've been like, oh my God, this is such a great tool to use the data to generate a bunch of ideas and insights, rapidly sort of test these hypotheses. Because one of the things he actually did in those meetings, he would make you ask a question, and we'd look at the data live and slice and dice the data to actually answer that particular question. And having the ability to do that just cut through so much of that opinionated, like, oh, this is what we must do kind of thing that you were talking about, TJ. So that was my aha moment for a data culture. And ever since, I've been like, okay, what is our framework? How do we set this up so that we can like rapidly arrive at these decisions or rapidly test a bunch of different opinions? It's been like so powerful. So yeah, that's my story.
And I want to play off that. You said something, Krishna, that I love. It's the sort of real-timeness of data. And it is still kind of amazing, again, coming from my world of global health, where how few organizations are using real-time data to make decisions. And so think of COVID, right? And at the beginning of COVID, and our introduction to the Metabase team was really at the very beginning of COVID. We were building all these sorts of cool tools in Metabase. And people were looking at us like, we're a small company based out of Seattle. And they're like, why is this company doing real-time data when the US government and state governments aren't doing it yet? And I think it's this exact thing where real-time data is still sort of this, like, people look at it as like magic. And it's like, it's not magic. You just have to be thoughtful about it. You have to be proactive about it. And when you really think about like setting the stage for the next several years in your organization, whether you're talking about COVID or you're talking about building new features in a product, you have to be thinking down the road and so that way you're prepared to take advantage of that real-timeness of data to make decisions and to be more nimble.
Maybe you could talk more about what you mean, TJ, about being prepared.
Yeah, so I think it's twofold, right? So I think one of them is knowing what data that you need to have so that you can start making decisions when the time comes, right? So you might be like in the middle of a product cycle and you're being very thoughtful and methodical about like making your decisions, and you can plan that out ahead. But in my world, you're being much more sort of, you have to be ready to move at a moment's notice when something pops up, a disease pops up, or medicines are being deployed to a country and nobody knows where those medicines are. And so a good example of using data in real time and being prepared is to take that data and sort of stage it, clean it, make sure that it's inside of a BI tool, Metabase, or what have you, so that when you're asked a question of, hey, TJ, we have 8 million tablets of this medicine. and we don't have any idea where they are. 5 years ago, it would take 2 weeks to track down those medicines. Now, and this is a real world example, that this is one of our clients is our big pharmaceutical company that donates medicines all over the world. 2 weeks has now gone to 30 seconds. And literally yesterday, somebody came to us, and in fact, they don't even come to us anymore. They don't even ask us, because they have a dashboard that's available to anybody really to go and say, oh, my 8 million tablets are on a container ship sitting on a port in East Africa. And so being prepared and having that sort of data staged and cleaned and ready so that you can start asking questions, and you don't have to get a professional to do it for you, and you don't have to wait 2 weeks to get the answer. That's really the big key.
I actually love that. And that's a great example, TJ, of how you achieve tactically a great outcome, but also from a strategic perspective, it informs your mental model of how the world works, right? So the more you consume data, the more you're immersed in the data, you have this mental model. So when you get something new, when you encounter a new question, you're thinking, oh my God, should I react to this urgently, or is this just an anomaly? And the more you're immersed in the data, the more you can decide whether something is just an anomaly, a flash in the pan, or it's something that's critical and you need to react to it. And honing that mental model, that exercising that muscle is so powerful.
Yeah.
One thing that I'm curious to hear maybe you riff on, and maybe this is a bit of a segue, is we wanted to talk a little bit about how you can go about trying to affect a change from data being perceived as sort of a secondary source of truth within an organization to more of a primary source of truth. And I don't know if this is the case, but I wonder if either of those points you both touched on, be it being prepared and having the data at hand versus or separately being immersed in the data, if either of those qualities in an organization can contribute to that transition. Or to phrase this in the opposite, is the lack of either of those things, the preparedness of data or the lack of immersion, are those things that keep data from being, a primary source of truth in an organization? Not necessarily because, maybe because they act as hindrances towards that actually, happening. And actually, before you answer that, I'll just remind folks who maybe have joined us, more recently, if you have any questions for TJ or for Krishnan towards the end of our Q&A, of our chat, you can just go ahead and put that in the Q&A tab. But now I'll go ahead and let you guys speak.
Yeah, I can speak to the product development world for sure. And I love having TJ as a co-panelist because I get to hear about something, an industry that I don't even know about. But like in the product development world, there's so much emphasis on efficiency, like trying to figure out how you can get a product out to users and how you can add value in the shortest amount of time. And one of the things that helps drive this efficiency is templates and processes. Like we do product requirement documents, we do PRDs, we do all of that like stuff. We do Scrum. All of these are methodologies to keep us efficient, to keep us moving towards like delivering user value. And what I've found is like to go from secondary to primary, like you were asking, Maz, is your data in the template? Like, are you asking, for example, before you enter the product development process, are you asking for, oh my God, we need this data, otherwise we cannot start? And is that like a necessary prerequisite? And when you're reviewing templates with the team, or when you're reviewing your PRDs, for example, are you thinking through, will we have the data we need to make a data-informed decision? That just that one simple thing has been so powerful in switching like the mindset for product development, at least from, oh, this is data we're all collecting, but we'll use it whenever we have to no, this is the primary thing we need before we can start a new feature, before we can like, implement anything forward, or before we can understand, or before we can exit from a recent launch. That's been one thing. The other thing I found very useful, and I did this at Clockwise, I've done this at Clockwise a bunch of times, and I wish I'd done this earlier in my career, actually. But when someone's in a meeting, we're talking through this, and someone says, oh, I think we should do this because X, this is the most important thing. Can you in real time go and say, oh, you know what? You asked that question 10 minutes ago. I went and did like some analysis on the back end, and here's the answer that you were looking for. And so now we know that, path X is the right thing to do, or path Y is the right thing to do. And if you do this enough times in meetings, it builds confidence that you actually have the data like available, handy to look at any time. And that sort of engenders this like cycle almost, where people then come to you and say, oh, I remember last time you had this dashboard, but now I have a new question. Like, can I use your dashboard now for this new question? And I think that's another really interesting way to sort of make data culture more primary.
I love that example because we come, as you mentioned, Krishna, we come from such different worlds. Although I was a product kind of guy 10 years ago, but we have a similar kind of example in the global health world. It's a little bit different, but hear me out. We work with a really large, really large global health organization, and their data framework and data culture is emerging later than you may want it to have, but they're getting there. So that's the good news. But the way we sold them on a particular platform, a data platform, was to go from secondary to primary, was to actually demonstrate its utility in real time. And so they were very resistant to this. And it's sort of the MVP concept, right? It's like, let me just put something small out into the world. And when we think of MVP, we think of product, right? Well, data has the same concept, right? Let me just take a fraction of what you're doing and let me demonstrate how this can help make your life better. And 3 years ago, when we started this process, this organization was extremely resistant to publishing data and making data more transparent. And when they started to see, as simple as it sounds, how fewer questions they were getting about data when they made it transparent, people could serve themselves. They all of a sudden went from being like, we don't want this, we're resistant to this, to being like, oh, can we add more things to this? Can you add more data? And we're like, you know what, we sure can. And so that concept of demonstrating utility, and especially in a world, again, coming back to global health, where you're dealing with epidemiologists and physicians and statisticians who are really brilliant people, but may not really fully understand data and may not fully understand technology. So you have to sell them on the concept of why this data is important. And what we found is, again, demonstrating the utility through like micro deployments, or however you want to call it, has been really transformative for us in terms of getting these people to accept this mindset.
Yeah, that's a great example. What I get from your example, though, is it's so that light bulb moment goes off the minute you have your first like inroad with the data. It's so great, like it's amazing. For anyone on the call, and I'm sure you all have gone through this, but like for anytime you get the question, oh, I don't know what to do, I think in my head immediately it says, oh, what data will let you decide? And if that association is like automatic, and every time you have uncertainty, you're like, data is the answer, it starts building that culture really quick. You'll not always find your answers in the data. And some things, for example, data can tell you what, but it can't tell you why something is happening, which is like super important. But yeah, just keeping that question front of mind, keeping an ear out for like, what are the opportunities where someone says, I don't know what to do? That's the opportunity for you to jump in and say, maybe there's data around this. Right?
Yeah, and one problem we have, in just again riffing on this concept, one problem we have is we've now, like, again, people were sort of resistant to data for a long time, and now they've gone from going, I don't really understand data, I don't know why we need it, to like, I want data, to like, TJ, tell me what I should do here. I'm like, whoa, hold on here. Like, I'm here to present the data in a factual manner. You still need subject matter experts who know how to interpret that data, I guess, which is kind of one of the things you're saying. And especially in global health, there's like, well, what should we do? COVID, people were asking me what I should do. I'm like, let me just be real clear here about what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. I'm good at data. I am not good at prescribing, regulations and whatever. But it's interesting how data can turn somebody into a subject matter or perceived to be a subject matter expert really quick if you're not careful.
Definitely one of the pitfalls. I agree.
That's great. Maybe we can turn to the practical a little bit. Not that you have been speaking only in the abstract, but for some of these people, I think I'm even seeing some questions coming in related to this. Some people are probably wondering, in the audience, about how one goes kind of from the zero state to the sort of platonic ideal. How do you go from a place where you're not collecting any data, you have no visibility into it, to a world where perhaps you have a lot of data? What tools should you use? How do you I don't know, sequence this out? What are maybe like the almost milestones or eras of, or almost, checkpoints along this journey that you can kind of look forward to get you to a place like that? Maybe even touch on an approach to team building around like a data team or building out, the team to use that data.
I'll kick this one off because this is something I think a lot about, and just again, one of the interesting points of view we have is working with such a variety of organizations. Again, what's global health and education and elsewhere, is we probably have worked with about 100 organizations now on very similar problems. And from that, we've kind of created what we call this data experience framework. So you're familiar with user experience and customer experience. And we think data experience sort of belongs in the same sort of strata as those two, in terms of thinking about what data do you need to answer your questions, which means you really got to back up even one step further and say, what questions do you have? And again, coming from a global health perspective, what we see a lot is people just going out and saying, we're going to collect data. And we're like, okay, well, what questions do you have? And they're like, we have 75 questions. We're like, okay, let's cull that down. Let's simplify, and then we can add more down the road. So I think it starts with what questions are you trying to get answers to? Fundamentally, what is the outcome you're looking for? And then sort of designing a methodology for collecting that data. And again, because we are in the business of helping organizations collect data, not just analyze data, but like, how do I even get the data? Because we're talking about organizations that primarily use pen and paper for collecting data right now. So what questions are you trying to get to? So define those and simplify as much as you possibly can. And you can always grow from there. What tools are you going to use to collect that? Is it a smartphone? Is it a tablet? Are you collecting data from a secondary source? Are you pulling it from the CDC website, what have you? And then okay, start to look at what team do you need to analyze that? Do you need data engineers to kind of clean and purify the data? Do you need data analysts, data scientists? And then last but not least, how do you tell the story, right? And again, this goes back to the concept of user experience and customer experience. It's all about storytelling. Even in global health, when you're talking about how many people might be sick, how many people might potentially get sick, it's a story, and you have to have a compelling both narrative and then visualization to kind of help people understand quickly that, okay, this village over here has a real problem, whereas the villages around it do not. We can prioritize our efforts towards this village. And I think kind of laying it out in that sort of discrete framework of questions, collection, team, and then ultimately visualization and storytelling is what we kind of guide our customers on. And that sort of helps you go from 0 to 60, but in a linear fashion, as opposed to like, I'm just going to collect data and then figure out what the hell I'm doing next.
Oh my God, TJ, that resonates. Everything you said resonates so much with me. That is just a fantastic framework for how to think about it. Rather than like, do something different, I'm just going to add my experiences to your framework because I've seen this exact process play out so many different times. Really, it starts with the goals. So if you're an executive team, you're trying to figure out, where are my customers coming from? What's my revenue looking like? What's my churn looking like? And those are the fundamental questions you want to answer. And if you move that like lens to a sales team, for example, they're trying to see, who are my leads? Who's most interested? It could be product-led sales where they're like, who's using the product the most? Or it could just be like general sales where they're like, who are the most interested leads? How do I gauge that level of interest and sentiment? Where would I be most effective selling? For marketing, it's like, which channels are more effective? Like, where are people like paying attention? And for customer success, it's like, who's using it? Who's not using your product, right? So no matter what the department, they have these high-level burning questions in their minds, and like getting that down on paper first, understanding the goals and outcomes you want to drive, and then having the primitive data that you need to answer those questions is a great starting point to go from 0 to like 10, perhaps not 60. And then exactly what you said, the problem that often arises is data literacy. It's like, there's this initial dashboard which now says, oh, these are my customers, these are like X, and these are facts. Now, what do you do with them? And that's the other piece. How do you slice and dice? And typically this requires like some data analysis expertise to sort of figure out how you build your metrics, how do you slice and dice your data? What do you summarize against? How do you group? And that data analysis expertise could be like dedicated data analysts, or it could be like a self-service like tool that lets you do exactly some of that. Metabase is great for this sort of stuff, like the sort of questions approach. And then once you go there, once you've reached that, the last bit which you mentioned, which is so vital and crucial, the storytelling, that's the piece I've seen to be the weakest, because you end up having a lot of data and then suddenly you have no way to sort of string discrete data points together to tell the story of where you're going. I've had to jump in many times and tell that story, but it's one of the hardest things for me to sort of instill that storytelling muscle. I think that's like the hardest piece of the puzzle. So I'd love to learn from you on like some more examples on how that storytelling has been successful for your clients. But yeah, love your framework.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I would say we've gotten pretty good at the storytelling aspect of it, because we've put a primary focus on simplicity. And so again, going back to COVID, I can still go to 1 million websites and be like, what the hell is going on? I don't even know how many cases of COVID are happening, because whomever built the dashboard was building it for epidemiologists, and epidemiologists think in sort of multiple dimensions. The average user, you have to always remember, again, it comes back to user, again, it's an experience thing. Who is consuming the data? And I have this sort of simple kind of test, is like, I call it the mom test. Can I show my mom a visualization? My mom's 77 and I love her to death. She's smart as hell. She doesn't know anything about, she doesn't do anything in my world. And can I show her this? And she's like, oh yeah, like, oh shit, deaths are trending up. This is not good. And it's something that she can process really quickly, then that's good. But if I'm building something again for scientists or statisticians, that can be more complex, that can be more thorough. So it's understanding your audience. But the interesting thing I'll say, and this maybe is the difference between working with organizations that don't have engineers on staff, whereas like y'all have probably a big technical staff, is the data engineering is still the hardest part. Getting data to a place where people can slice and dice it and they can start asking questions is still something that I don't think there's a lot of great solutions out there. Metabase is wonderful, and we're big Metabase fans. We've deployed hundreds of dashboards at this point in Metabase, but there's other solutions out there. I'm not saying that, Maz, but there are. But data engineering, there's just not a lot of good tools out there for sort of taking, your primary data and rotating it and merging it and cleaning it and finding outliers and all that sort of stuff. So that way you can sort of say, I need to understand my data. So for us, the visualization is still hard, to be clear, because it's a little bit more art than science. But the engineering is still, it's still, a lot of people have a hard time with that.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because yeah, that is actually an interesting other aspect of team building, is engineering. And what comes to mind when you say data engineering is exactly that, which is how do you clean the data? How do you sort of transform it? How do you take raw sources and make it usable? But then there's one last step to that engineering, which is like, can this data flow to the tools where it's going, where the tools that users are using, right? And can they use that data to make correlations with other like stimuli that they're getting in those tools? That seems abstract, so I'm going to give a concrete example. Like our marketing team uses HubSpot for marketing, and when they see a bunch of like unsubscribes, it's so useful to see that particular, if all the unsubscribes are coming from like one company, it's so useful to see if the trend of utilization in that company has like led to some sort of like motion. And it's there's the actions that you take after this correlation can be so different. But if you didn't have that data in that tool in the first place, you would never be able to make this correlation, and you'd be shooting in the dark. So yeah, it's such a you've hit the nail on the head.
I like the word stimuli. That's such a good, like, again, taking these multiple data sources and sort of saying X and Y is happening, is Z related, and X and Y were data sources you collected elsewhere. It might be something completely unrelated, but you've brought them into the mix, and now you have this really powerful data set that you can easily merge together and start to ask questions. So yeah, that's such a good addition to that concept of engineering.
Maybe you're sort of touching on some of the inherent, complexities in wrangling data already. I mean, you are. one of the things that I've observed or heard anecdotally, never having really done data from 0 to 60 myself in a big organization, is you often hear about people getting overwhelmed. There's sort of like that, they think that, I'll just get as much data as I can. I get to the sort of this nirvana state where I have bajillions of dashboards, data by the terabytes. But then there can be this paralysis at times of where to look or what to do with this all. I don't know if there's anything that either of you want to share about ways to sort of handle that sort of end of the spectrum of like, I'm creating a data-driven culture in my company. We are at the stage in the journey where we maybe almost have too much. And what do you do, when you're at that point in the journey, maybe?
Yeah, I can kick this one off, I think, because it's a problem we've had many times. The best analogy I can think of, especially in these summer times when travel's like a pain, is actually going to an airport. So when you go into an airport, you're kind of like lost. It's like this mess of people running around all in directions, different sets of things to do. And if it weren't for like this strict guardrail process where you check in first, you drop your bags, you go to the security check, and then you like get to your gate and your gate is numbered. So we've learned this process in an airport over time as we travel more and more. But without that guardrail, we'd be lost. We'd be like, oh my God, I have no idea whether I'm actually going to get on a plane going to where I want to go, or whether I'm just going to be like hunkering under one of the like chairs in the restaurant. And I think it's like that. When you have too much data, it's kind of like that. And so you sort of need these guardrails for how do I consume this? And that could be, for example, a set of like very rigorous, very highly curated and cleaned dashboards where you can go and get like 80% of your questions answered. And that's your first port of call. And then from that, you take your dashboards as springing off points. I'm like, hey, I want to learn a bit more about this particular thing. So you dive into one of your like elements in your dashboard, you ask more questions, you learn how to sort of like navigate that. And then you hit a wall, which is, oh, even with this, I can't answer a specific question that I want. And that's either like a gap in the data or a gap in your knowledge. And like the ability to have a process to take you on both of these paths. Like, for example, if there's a gap in the data, can I funnel that request to a data team? Or can I figure out, or can I outsource it, for example, to someone who can help build out our data pipeline? And if it's a gap in knowledge, what are the training and resources and like videos, brown bags, documentation, what's available to sort of give you that next step of like where you can go with the data. So putting these guardrails in place, I think is just vital and instrumental. Apart from all this other stuff that we were talking about getting the data from an engineering perspective to the tools where you want to like use it and analyze it. But yeah, just having these guardrails is vital. In the absence of these guardrails, what happens is very often you have a bunch of people like asking a bunch of questions, and everyone has a different way to sort of slice and dice, and you end up with having like 89 charts, most of which have the same sort of names, each of which like is using a different like sort of interpretation on how to slice and dice. And there's just chaos. Like no one knows what the source of truth is, and you just lose trust in your data. So like step one is like, if you have a data question, do you know where to go? And if you don't know the answer to that question, that is the first thing to go do. Right? Like organize your dashboards or like organize your learning material. And so that answering that speaking off point and then slowly building out the pipeline to get to like insight, I think is super, super vital in this scenario.
I want to take everything you just said, Krishnan, and like print it up and put it on a bolt, poster board, because the airport metaphor is perfect. The only thing I would change is to take away, the arrivals and departures and just be like, a lot of people just walk in an airport and they're like, what do I do now? That would be, but you're right. Like there's guardrails that sort of like say you should go here and then you should go here and then you should go here. That's exactly, I love that so much. That's such a good way of describing it. I will say on a practical matter, one thing that we've started doing is we kind of think of ourselves as data librarians or data curators, whatever you want to call it, because you're spot on. In our education work, they sent me a file just recently with I think 400 columns. And I was just like, what the hell, guys? And they're like, well, this is what the system outputs, some other system. And I was like, well, how many of these columns do you use? And they're like, 6. And so, everybody who's on this, all the attendees are nodding their heads right now because we've all been there. And I think it's having somebody whose job is it to curate and call out the data and not necessarily throw away the data, right? Because you may need that at a later date. And this is what I told this customer. It's like, hey, let's keep that, but we're going to put it away because when you go in there, you don't want to have to wade through 400 things to get to the 6 you need. So one thing we've been really proactive about, again, is sort of curating data. And I'm going to sound like a Metabase salesman. I'm not getting compensated by this, everybody. But the verified, I can't remember what the hell y'all call it now, but the verified collections has been really clutch because what we've been doing is sort of, and the customer at first was like, why am I doing this? I don't understand. I'm like, just trust me on this. So that when other people come in, there's a visual cue to them, like this collection has been vetted, it has been curated, it is clean, this is the gospel. These other collections might be experimental, they might be interesting, but they're going to be, you shouldn't necessarily rely on them. You shouldn't necessarily pull a thing out and put it into your PowerPoint presentation. But these verified collections, you should. And so we've been doing that a lot. And again, that speaks to this idea of curation. And it speaks to, Maz, to the question you asked a couple of minutes ago, is what team do you need? And I think it's, you need engineers and analysts, but you also need somebody who's thinking about the experience, and it's thinking about like what data, how am I going to tell this story, and what other things are just sort of interesting but not necessarily authoritative.
That's great. Thanks for those answers.
Sorry, Maz, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
No, I was just going to say very quickly that collections have been great for me too, because they provide the first exit on the highway. Like you set up your collections, you're like, hey, this is where you go. You found something in the set of collections that you want, the dashboard collections that you want, exit. You don't have to do anything else. And then when you haven't found something in what you want, that's when you sort of continue on that highway. And then you go, oh, now I need a custom question. Well, here's the data set that I can use to ask that custom question. And that's still a challenge. Like that second exit is still like, to extend this crazy analogy, it's just like very far flung from the first one because you just need so much more like curiosity, and it takes so much more like willpower to actually go dig there that you want. But yeah, spot on.
Yeah, be it a freeway or an airport, it sounds like wayfinding or signage is kind of the analogy that we're grasping for. Maybe with the last 5 or 10 minutes that we have, we can field some of the questions that we've been getting. And just in case anybody didn't hear me mention, if you do have a question for our panelists, you can go ahead and put that in the Q&A section below. One of the first questions we have here is, it sounds like this person maybe is in a smaller business that's kind of just getting started in their data journey. And maybe we kind of touched on this a bit, but I think there's an interesting little specific here, which is the question is, how can an analyst, especially maybe if they're the only analyst or the first analyst in an organization, help to motivate owners, by which I'm going to interpret the question means, maybe like executives, to use data for decisions in small businesses that used to use intuition, like they relied on intuition before. So what are the first steps for that, early or only analyst to orient that business towards a data culture instead of an intuition culture?
I could go, and I'm sure you have, sorry, TJ, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
From my experience, this goes back to, it's kind of like, it's a problem where there's a lot of ambiguity in the beginning. You don't know where to start. Like everyone's throwing around opinions and there's no clear way. The key thing that I would recommend here is listening. And what I mean by that is like, there's these questions where these opinions are throwing around. And if you find a point where you say, oh, that's an opinion which we could have like looked at the data about, take that back. Instead of trying to influence like decision making in the moment, the ideal way to do it would be to take that back, go look at the data, see how the data can lead you one way or the other, and then sort of come back and in maybe 2 days or 3 days or however long it takes to analyze the data and say, hey, this was a question we had. I took a look at this data, and now these are the 3 different options that the data presents. And that's a good way to sort of rethink decisions, unless the speed of decision making is so fast that this is impossible in real time. But I think just being watchful and mindful of what are those opinionated decisions? Is there one of those that we can take a couple of days, look at the data and see if it's the right thing? And being persistent at this, it's not going to be an overnight, just because we did this the one time, everyone's going to start making data-driven decisions. Being a bit persistent, following up on this weekly, maybe even a weekly newsletter saying data decision of the week or something, and then following it up again and again and again. I think that pays a lot of dividends over the long run.
That's great.
I'll kind of take it from a completely different point of view. And I'm a big fan of just doing something and asking for forgiveness later. So I run a small business. I've worked at small businesses, and I've worked for people who are resistant to automation, to data, to what have you. And what I found to be really effective is to sort of say, and I'll use a real world example in our contemporary kind of work environment, is that we have a client who are using us because they gather a lot of data and then compile this fancy report they have to send in, takes them 3 weeks. Because it's just a lot of data and it's a lot of manipulation. And it's just really, really a pain in the ass. What I would do is I would find a pain point like that, where there's a lot of data, a lot of something that's happening that takes a lot of time, and automate that in a data-driven framework. And then go to your boss and say, look, I know you're maybe not interested in data, or you may not understand the utility of it, which those people do exist, trust me. But I've now taken this thing that would take 3 person weeks to do, which is 120 hours, right? Which costs, let's just say $12,000. I'm now taking that, and instead of taking 3 weeks, it takes 30 seconds. Now, granted, I had to do about 100 hours of work ahead of time, but instead of repeating that 120 hours every 3 weeks or every month, we've front loaded it, and now it takes 30 seconds. And it's actually going to come to your inbox every day at 8 a.m. Right. And I think demonstrating a return on that investment and showing that automation and sort of data frameworks in the end can save time and save money is a good foot in the door to start saying, okay, now that you've seen the utility of that, now how do we take that one step further and say, how do we implement a data-driven framework where we're actually starting to make decisions because of data? So I think you start with saving time and money, because honestly, that's what small business owners think. They're talking about cash flow, and they're talking about how do I get from point A to point B. So solve that problem, and then move on to okay, now let's start thinking about making decisions with data. And once you've kind of proven that, then the resistance will go down, and the likelihood of acceptance will go up.
That's great. Let's field another question. I actually think this next one we kind of just answered. I say we. You both did a great job of answering that. So I'm going to go to this other one, which is maybe as you're rolling out your data program, you're trying to get people more data driven. You want to get some feedback along the way, to know that you're doing it right, or that it's taking hold, or that you've got some traction. What do you both think are maybe some early indicators that you're successfully building a data-driven culture? And what are some warning signs, maybe conversely, of a data-driven culture reverting back to previous patterns?
I'll jump. I think my answer is probably going to be pretty simple. I think it's demand. What we found is organizations that are sort of resistant, and to be very clear, we've been successful at implementing this data-driven framework in a lot of organizations, but we've also failed. And when we failed, it's likely because the organization hasn't either decided that it's culturally significant to them, that it's not something that they want to do. And you can always tell, and this is true, and Krishnan will I think validate this as a product guy. Do people want it? Do people demand it? And if they don't, and again, it doesn't matter if you're building a new feature, or you're building a new dashboard, or you're doing whatever, silence is killer. It means that they just don't care. And so they're going to continue to, again, use their instinct or their intuition to make decisions. So that's the thing you don't want. What you want is for people to come to you and say, this shit is broken. Here's how you fix it. This is what I need. And a lot of people perceive that as a negative, but that's a positive sign. I mean, I want people to tell me my stuff is broken, because if they do, that means they care, and that means they need it. And so again, this is a sort of an abstract answer, but it's whether or not people tell you, they come to you and say, this is work, this is what I need, and this is working, and they keep coming to you, or if they ghost you. If they ghost you, then that's not good. You haven't found the pain point.
100%, that is the answer, demand. I actually have two stories because I couldn't agree more with TJ. One story is I was recently talking to one of our designers, and this is one of the new growth initiatives we have. And I was like, hey, this is the user flow that I think would be great. And the first question she asked was, wait, how do our current users do this today with our data? And that made me so happy, because there's an instant pushback. She wasn't thinking about how do I get this work done. She was thinking about, why is this real? Like, tell me why this is real. And that's a sign of successful data culture. And the second story I have is my customer success lead reached out yesterday, and she said, when is this data landing? I've been waiting for this for 2 weeks. And that's the second sign of like a data culture, because if you've got people hungry, like if you've got people waiting, it's painful because you can't solve their needs, but it also means that you're important and you're part of their process. And that's like a really good indicator. But there is a good second part to this question, which is like, how do you know it's reverting? And for me, the warning signs are the more I hear, I think we should do this, or feels like we should do this. And those words are trigger words for me, because that means that, oh, maybe there's not enough data to answer that question. It's not always the case. But it is like a good early sign of like, oh, wait, shouldn't there be data to answer this question? Like, and maybe the answer is no, but like, yeah, it's interesting. Because I've been in a position before where the data was pointing to one thing that was not the right thing to do. It's happened as well. But yeah, I would say those are my trigger signs, really.
And I think this is not answering the question, but I really like the point you just made, Krishnan. I think there is a tendency, and not really in my world, but I've seen it, where people are so reliant on data. They're like, everything I'm going to do is data driven. And I'm like, well, human instinct sometimes is helpful, and human interaction to interpret those things is definitely useful. So I think we shouldn't make the mistake of saying, well, data can answer all the questions. It can't. It simply cannot. It can help you, and you can look at that data, but I think you still need people to kind of look at things, and sometimes to override the data, and sometimes it's like, well, and again, in my world of global health, where we're talking about drug delivery and deploying medicines in remote parts of the world, you do need a person to say, okay, I know that the data is telling me that I should send 2 million tablets of this medicine here, but we simply cannot. It won't work, because there's we can divert that elsewhere. And so again, be mindful of human interaction and human intuition and human instincts that are useful in implementing a data-driven framework.
Great. We're actually going to have to wrap here, folks. Time has flown by, and you both have done such an awesome job at answering those questions and giving us your stories and your insights. So I just want to say thank you both to you, TJ, and you, Krishnan, so much for your time and your thoughts. For our attendees, I just wanted to let you know that we have recorded this chat, and we will be posting it on Metabase's LinkedIn profile, so you can find it there if you want to refer back, or if you really enjoyed it and you want to share it with your friends or your colleagues, please do. We would love that. TJ and Krishnan, where could people follow you online if they want to hear more of your thoughts and what you're up to?
LinkedIn's a great place for me. So find me on LinkedIn. Happy to connect and chat some more.
Yeah, same. Find me on LinkedIn. There's not a lot of TJ Muehlemans out there. If you want to know about e-bikes and nachos, follow me on Twitter at TJ Muehl. I don't really do a lot of anything else on Twitter besides that.
It's great. Well, to all of you, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this. You can, of course, find us at metabase.com, and please go ahead and follow us on Twitter for more chats like these in the future. Thanks so much, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thanks, DJ. Bye.